My name is Michelle Olkers, and I'm the Managing Partner of Mazars in Cape Town. We're very pleased to have you all here today, and I think that we've got some great speakers to tell us a little bit more about what Minister Nene presented to us yesterday and in his maiden budget speech, and just to understand the implications of that for you as an individual as well as on your business and from an economic perspective. So we're going to start the proceedings today with Hilton Saven, who's our National Chairman, who's going to share a little bit about Mazars. He's also our co-CEO of Mazars International and is a member of our group executive board internationally. Hilton?
Welcome everybody, it's wonderful to see you all. Hard to believe that a year has actually passed since we did our last presentation, but it's amazing how time flies. Just when I was walking in this morning, I was listening to a conversation about some people who were thinking about going on some of the rides afterwards. I just want to make it clear at this point in time, we don't take any liability for any of the rides that you may partake on. But it's really nice to have you all with us, and what I'm going to try and do is to give you a little bit of information about Mazars from first of all from an international point of view, and second of all from a national point of view. I know I've only got 5 minutes, so obviously we have to keep to that because we've got obviously the main speakers who are going to be talking after me. So what I would like to do is just to talk for a few minutes about the key facts and figures about the Mazars Group. I'd like to look at the group results with you. Our year end is the 31st of August every year, so we've just had a closing of our last year, which is August 14. Talk a little bit about Mazars South Africa, and then spend a little bit of time on the non-attest services that we've invested quite heavily over the last number of years. So just to let you have some of the facts and figures is that we're in 73 countries around the world. The fee income for the year ending 31 August 2014 was just over €1 billion. It's interesting that 70% of our revenue is in fact outside of France. I'm often asked the question about how big is the French practice, where obviously Mazars started, and over the years as we've grown, so the significance of the French practice has in fact become less. We have 553 offices around the world, 14,000 people, and we audit in excess of 500 listed companies. In terms of where we are around the world, we're pretty much in most of the places. The largest area where we operate is in Europe, where in fact a significant portion of the fee income that we do is actually written. But over the last number of years, what we've seen is that North America has become more important for us, and we have a significant strategy in place to extend the US and North America to get somewhere near where the size of Europe is. It's interesting to look at the different growth aspects of the world and to look where in fact the opportunities are. And what we've seen over the last number of years is that Asia has obviously been the leader in terms of growth. But surprisingly enough, if you look at Africa, the actual growth prospects in Africa are probably at this point in time somewhere close to what they are in Asia. Most of the countries to the north of us have got growth rates that we would envy, which is somewhere around about 5%. And if you look at the opportunities in terms of sub-Saharan Africa, which I will allude to a little bit later, you'll see that it should have a huge impact. In terms of the group results, as I've said, the turnover for 31st August 2014 was just over $1 billion, which represents a 5.8% increase in fees. And I think we have to take that into context of Europe, and Europe being in recession for the last number of years, because a number of the countries in Europe where we operate, be it France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, are in in fact, have gone through quite severe recessions where the growth has been, in fact, negative in certain industries. So 5.8% has been a really good achievement. Just in terms of the number of partners we have on a worldwide basis, we have 748 partners. We have 11,400 staff who would work on the technical aspects, and then our administration staff of just over 1,900. If we look at Mazars in South Africa, we joined, in fact, the group on the 1st of September 2007. At that particular point in time, just as a matter of interest, the euro was R9.50. So at 14 odd today, you can see the significance in terms of the conversion that we've seen. In South Africa, we have about 950 people at this point in time. This is an interesting time for us because this is when we take on our new article clerks around the country. They sign articles at this point in time, so the figure of 900 is probably closer to about 950. In terms of offices and where we operate, we really operate in the main centres around the country. It hasn't been our strategy or the philosophy just to put dots on a map. We believe we need to be present in areas where the services are required by our clients. In terms of Africa, I just want to spend a few minutes about Africa because this is a particular slide that I enjoy showing to people overseas because I think people don't get the idea of what the extent and size of Africa is. And we take a lot of responsibility for Africa being the second largest economy and certainly having the best infrastructure in terms of all the countries in Africa. We've been charged with the responsibility of leading significant growth for Mazars within Africa. So when I put this slide, it kind of puts it into context in terms of what the size of Africa is, where you have 54 to 55 countries, where you have different languages, and it just shows the difficulty we have in terms of addressing this region and the growth potential that we have within the region. In terms of where we actually operate in the region, this shows where we have direct offices in terms of red. In terms of yellow, we have associate offices, but we also do work in a number of the other countries within Africa. And that, as I said, is a significant factor in terms of the strategy going forward. Over the last number of years, what we've seen is that we've seen a lot of multinationals who want to invest into Africa who choose to do so via South Africa. And there are many reasons for that, but I think the primary reason is that they want to use the infrastructure that we've built up within this country and establish a base in what they would see as a first world environment. In some of the services that we actually provide to these multinationals and some of the smaller companies, we'll see some of those services that we actually offer. So in terms of the non-attest services that I spoke about earlier, what we've done over the last number of years is that we've invested quite heavily into what we call the non-attest services, which is the non-audit services. And what we found is that clients are looking in many instances for a one-stop almost approach in terms of whether they do a transaction, whether they need forensic work, whether they need financial assistance or they need project finance, etc. And over the years, each of the areas that we've listed here, we've made significant investments in those areas. Just one of them that I would like to talk about is, in fact, what we call the outsourcing division, which is an interesting one. And what we're finding is that a lot of multinational companies and foreign companies who come into South Africa don't want to set up a full infrastructure when they first come into the country. What they want to do is to outsource a lot of their administrative services, be it payroll, be it finance, etc., until they get to a particular stage, and when they're happy they're at a particular scale, they then obviously would like to invest more fully. So we're seeing a lot more of that. What we're seeing also is a lot of companies, as I said, who are coming in, who are looking to set up a holding company in South Africa and to invest into the rest of Africa via those means. So I won't keep you any further. I just want to thank all of you. I know it's early in the morning, but to see this kind of turnout is actually fantastic. And I wish you all well. I'm going to hand over to Michelle, who's going to introduce Daniel.
Firstly, I would like to welcome Daniel Silk. Daniel is an independent political analyst, author and keynote speaker, specializing in South African and international politics. He has a specialist interest in political parties and elections and is a renowned futurist, lecturing widely on issues surrounding global change, volatility, and the future of the world. He is regarded one of South Africa's leading political commentators and most passionate public speaker.
Here we go. Right, can you all hear me at the back? Can you all hear me? Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you very, very much, Mazars, for inviting me to come and talk to you here this morning. It's a pleasure to be here for a variety of reasons, other than my respect for your particular company, and more importantly, the fact that I live extremely close within walking distance of this venue. I have a little hut underneath the roller coaster outside, and that's where I spend most of my time. I'm here to really give you sort of a contextual view of where this budget is in terms of the broader South Africa, the broader South African political economy. It's one thing, of course, to look at the figures, and we will look at the figures, of course, in Dai's presentation after mine. And the figures are critical because ultimately it's what's coming out of your back pocket, in particular, as a result of this budget. But let's put the budget into some context as to where we're going. And it was, I think, a budget yesterday. If we look at this rather sort of amusing quote from one of our well-known heads of state across the world in the last decade or two, yeah, I think we did have a budget yesterday, as George W. Bush perhaps said about some of his own budgets. But in the South African context, I do think that, sometimes we need some fortification to get us through discussing the matters of the day in this country in particular. I'm sorry that Mazars did not spring for something stronger with your coffee or your fruit juice this morning. If you need to bring out a hip flask during the course of my presentation, I can see you from here, but I promise I won't tell. Now, the big context of this budget, the big context to me as a political analyst, clearly, is what happened 13, 14 days ago. And all of you witnessed this particular event, I'm pretty sure. More of you than ever before were tuned into the parliamentary television channel or associated channels to watch this drama unfold. I mean, who needs generations in South Africa when you can have this on your screen? Now, clearly, this kind of event was a shock to the system. I felt a shock to my system as an analyst and as somebody who I expected to a degree levels of disruption on that particular evening, but I'm not quite sure whether we expected the ramifications, the totality of what happened during the day, the signal jamming issue, and of course the violence that occurred even within the hallowed halls of our National Assembly. So the budget occurs within this context. It was vitally necessary, in a sense, for the Minister of Finance to take us away from this. I always sort of feel this is like a sort of a flash forward, a nightmare that we might have about the future, and all of us in South Africa were exposed to this potential nightmare, and hopefully we're not going to get to this particular scenario. It was a chance for us to rebuild. We saw reality, or at least one scenario of reality. Hopefully we can restore our democracy over the next number of years. So it was critical, therefore, that Treasury, in effect, bring us back to serious business. And to a degree, I think the budget did accomplish that. It needed to move sentiment in South Africa. Sentiment had turned relatively negative, especially, of course, since the State of the Nation address, but sentiment was negative well prior to that for a number of reasons that I will articulate. Did it change sentiment? Did the budget have that effect on us? Did it have that effect on a foreign investor looking to come into South Africa, or a domestic investor here in South Africa looking to plow cash domestically, or still looking to plow cash perhaps outside of our country? I'm not quite sure that the budget had enough sentiment, positive sentiment drivers in it, but at least it showed a sort of steady as she goes approach. The budget occurs within a much more fragile political environment in South Africa. I'm a political analyst. I like fragility. I like change. So to me, I never fear change. And I think all of us will go through another period of witnessing political change in South Africa. But clearly, when a hegemonic political party like the ANC, and it's no different to any other big nationalist hegemonic political party, starts to fray at the edges, starts to lose a little bit of power here and there, starts to feel a little bit more insecure, well, it finds itself looking inwards. It finds itself protecting its own and protecting its own power base. And within that context, we saw the budget occur where there was little room for fresh or new policy initiatives. It was a budget really where the Minister of Finance's hands were somewhat tied by the complexities of the politics of the day in South Africa. These complexities are well known for all of us. We know that we're in a much more competitive political environment than we've ever been before in South Africa. And suddenly, there's this group of people who are really taking the debate, I suppose. Whether you agree with them or not, they're taking the debate to the ruling party. Yeah, I do believe that the EFF certainly is obviously a potential political disaster for South Africa, should they indeed come to power or hold any kind of balance of power in South Africa into the future. But they've changed the nature of our parliamentary chamber debate, and of course they also pose some sort of electoral threat to the ANC, particularly in Gauteng. Not just the EFF, but the DA as well. And in a sense, when we look at those local government election results from the national election results from last year, you saw how vulnerable the ANC became in the big metropoles in Gauteng. The Tshwanis, the Ekurhulenis, the city of Johannesburg, and in Port Elizabeth as well, I might add, where the ANC vote dropped to below 50%. If that is carried through into those local government elections next year, if the ANC does not win overall control over Tshwane, Pretoria, the capital of South Africa, I might add, I say that to people in Cape Town, the capital of South Africa, well, look at the symbolic effect that's going to have. So to me, shoring up power, you have to be a fancy analyst, shoring up political power is absolutely crucial. The ANC is more vulnerable because of its own internal difficulties within its alliance, particularly on the trade union flank of its alliance. It's fighting a rearguard action from populists who look to the EFF, but certainly, and I think more importantly, it's fighting its own trade unions within the alliance and those that have been excluded from COSATU as well. That's fragility for you in our political setup that we've never seen before in South Africa. So what effectively has the government done? Well, the government, of course, has locked in more workers into government employ over the course of the last 10, 12 years or so. Government has got bigger. And when government gets bigger, it costs you and me. Now, it's a fairly simple concept to see how tied the minister's hands were. When you look at the wage bill that the minister spoke about yesterday, when you look at that spending and you look to see how many more government employees there are over the course of the last decade, well, we are bringing people into government. The private sector haven't been hiring. The government sector have been hiring. We're bringing people into the broader state ambit. We're giving those people security. We're giving jobs. We're giving decent salaries. And in a sense, from a government point of view, we're locking them in to supporting the government because that's where their monthly salary comes from. There's a political ramification for this increase in the amount of those employed by government. We've rolled out social income grants, quite rightly, I might add, to indigent South Africans. And we're continuing to roll out these grants, and we saw yesterday in the budget, again, reference made to this. Perhaps the percentage increases in social income grants that were announced yesterday are more manageable than before. But when you, over the course of the last decade, roll out social income grants to nearly 17 million South Africans who are now reliant upon that check effectively, well, you can see trouble coming from the fiscus. You can see a potential deficit in order. More South Africans now receive grants, I might add, than are currently employed. And when you look at that kind of juxtaposition of where we are in South Africa, it's not sustainable in the medium to longer term. We need more people employed in South Africa than those receiving income grants. And that's the critical test for me in this kind of budget. Did it say anything about alleviating unemployment? Did it say anything about reversing that particular trend that we've seen in the country over the course of the last 10 years? And I'm not really sure that it did. We've got, of course, the well-known and much vaunted National Development Plan, a document that I tend to like, although I don't necessarily agree with everything in it. It's a 400-page tome, and I'm not quite sure how many of us have still read cover to cover all 400 pages. The document has been resurrected as a goal in Minister Nene's speech yesterday. And he referred to the National Development Plan quite a few times, and I'm happy that he did, because I thought this plan had got a little lost over the course of the last number of months. We know that there are disagreements within the ruling alliance about the National Development Plan. The fundamentals of the plan that call for raising employment through faster economic growth, improving the quality of education, skills development, building the capability and the capacity of the state, those goals of the NDP are certainly highly noble. And that's why I support the NDP. One of the critical issues for me in this NDP, obviously, other than getting to the magical 5% per annum GDP growth rate that the plan calls for in order to make a successful South Africa, the other key issue for me in this plan is creating a capable state, making that bureaucracy really work. And I might add, trying to depoliticize the bureaucracy, because the only way this bureaucracy is going to work in South Africa, the only way we're going to get better state-owned enterprises, if they are to remain within the ambit of the state, is to depoliticize the state and encourage efficiencies that will occur as a result of the depoliticization of the civil service. We saw yesterday extensive mention made to the parastatals, I might add, to the parastatals. Those parastatals are locked into the ruling alliance through multiple connections, ideological connections, business connections. And there's no indication that government really wants to shed its ideological commitment to the broad concept of state intervention and the state-owned enterprise model. There are over 700 state-owned enterprises of a variety of sizes in South Africa. And on the basis of that, you've seen the losses and the bailouts and the loan guarantees incurred by SAA and by the Eskom, and of course also by the rather unfortunately ailing South African Post Office. So again, the minister's hands are tied. If you're going to follow an ideologically driven policy of encouraging a developmental state with a big focus on state-owned enterprises, you're going to have to be prepared to bail out these guys time after time after time. And again, that constraint we saw again come through in the budget yesterday. Ultimately, of course, Minister Nene is working in an environment in which he's locked into some sort of ideological straitjacket. One always gets the impression very often in listening to Treasury that Treasury is the real conscience of government. Treasury are the guys who have to implement, find the cash, balance the books, and in a sense they've got to battle the ideologues that exist today within the ruling alliance. That ruling alliance today is certainly more divided, I would argue, on future policy than ever before. And Minister Nene's budget had to be the ultimate balancing act. It's a balancing act in a sense to keep that alliance relatively intact in advance of those very important local government elections next year, in which the ANC will be under pressure for the first time in these big metros. So the budget yesterday, in accordance with this general state of confusion within the ruling alliance, this general state of ideological malaise in the ruling alliance, provides us with more examples of mixed signals in South Africa. There are plenty of mixed signals, and you've seen evidence of this over the course of the last while. President Zuma quite rightly goes to Davos and says South Africa is open for business. That's what he says, and it all looks good, and the PR stuff looks good. But then there's a barrage of legislation that we are being faced with, and it still has to be clarified and ironed out and discussed in committee and evidence taken, piece after piece of legislation that either can negatively affect sentiment about South Africa or in fact can really affect our economy. And I'm particularly concerned about many of these bills that I've put up on the screen, but of course my big concern, certainly for the moment, are on issues surrounding land, because I think redistribution of land is important, but I think the messy nature of what's being proposed in terms of the new land heritage bill is something that I think can create negative sentiment about the country, and indeed can also attack food security in South Africa. All of these issues together, again, providing mixed signals to South Africa. And those mixed signals, again, are exacerbated by this confused relationship between the government, the labor movement, and the private sector. Government itself is not quite sure whether it really will embrace the private sector. On the one hand, it says, yes, we want more private sector involvement, but on the other hand, there's a suspicion, a negativity towards the capitalist or private sector interest, certainly within South Africa. Until this relationship is sorted out, I don't think we're going to get adequate economic growth in South Africa. This, to me, is at the core of why we are languishing, I think, at 2% growth rates. These sort of policy unknowns, this inertia, these roads to nowhere that we go on, again, clearly affect our economy. And the ultimate issue here is that politics is driving economics in South Africa at the moment. There's always a debate as to whether economics drives politics, or whether economics is the key driver, or whether politics is the key driver. And I think politics today drives economics. Keeping the alliance as relatively intact as possible is, I would argue, Jacob Zuma's main goal for the moment, and that means acquiescing, at least, to more populist demands, perhaps from the EFF on land and on labor, or to the trade unions, certainly, on labor. And I think we've seen that come through in the State of the Nation address. We've seen it come through in other pronouncements from government. They are looking over their left shoulder more than ever before and trying at least to placate those who may think about leaving for a trade union movement or the EFF into sticking around with the ANC at least for another period and at least into next year. But look, it's not just South Africa's own domestic politics. And you can sort of breathe a sigh of relief. It's not just our own politics that affects our economy. The broader world, we know, have great ramification on us. And we all live in a very interconnected world. It's a cliche, but for goodness sake, it's real. Europe's economy, it's still in part on life support, I might add. And you know, I'm quite sure about the relationship between these two. I'm not quite sure who the dominant partner is. They're all fighting for dominance in Europe at the moment. But this little country, 11.5 million people in Greece, 11.5 million. Look at the effect that crisis has had on Europe, on the potential domino effect that could be created if Greece moves out of the euro, if it defaults, on what could happen in Spain or Italy or Portugal, of any of the unfortunately named pigs groups of countries in the periphery of Europe. This has an effect on us. Europe's still a very important trading partner with South Africa, notwithstanding the rise of Asia. Of course, globally, we've seen a shift in economic sentiment, an improvement in the United States, in US GDP in particular. US GDP today leading the developing world by a fairly long shot as well. We've seen the oil price plunge over the course of the last 6 to 9 months or so. And you can listen to me with a degree of jaundiced skepticism, I suppose, but I love looking at projections from economists, and I love looking at graphs, and what we need to do is you need to interrogate all of these graphs and projections and forecasts a year or two later. Don't just look at how they are today. Here's the graph from Oxford Economics, a very renowned, of course, economic think tank, which shows the effect. It shows the effect of a lower oil price on the GDPs of a number of countries across the world. And what's interesting here in this particular graph is that Oxford Economics predict that South Africa would be amongst the best beneficiaries of a lower oil price, largely because we import most of our oil. The Philippines would be number 1, the Slovak Republic 2, South Africa would be the 3rd best recipient of a lower oil price to boost our GDP. And then what happens yesterday? Whatever we gained, in a sense, through the reduction in the price of oil, in terms of your pockets, in terms of the pockets of the consumer, was taken away from us in terms of an 80-cent plus levy, a series of levies on fuel. Whatever we had gained, more or less. And if we assume that the oil price is going to plateau now at these lower levels, and the price has actually bounced back off the bottom as it happens, we will see a larger than 80 cents price increase over the next 2 months here in South Africa. The effects of that have simply been lost. You can be happy, though, that you don't live in Norway or in Russia or in Venezuela or in Nigeria, where the real effect of the decline in oil is going to be felt on budgets. The broader global environment has a has an impact. That broad commodity super cycle that we've been speaking about for the last number of years, well, you can see on the graph. You can see precious metals, industrial metals, and coal, the prices have dropped and dropped precipitously over the course of the last year, year and a half or so. If we at a plateau in that commodity cycle, it may improve in the next few years, but if we're at a plateau, it's no surprise that the minister's hands are tied in terms of the receipts and revenues generated from our mining industry, in terms of a weaker currency, as most developing markets that rely upon commodities have now weaker currencies. So again, if you look at the figures and you look at the economic projections over the course of the next few years and you look to see who's doing well and who's not doing well, our projected GDP growth for the next year is 2%. 2%, that's all it is. Nowhere near the 5% that the NDP says we need to have in terms of our GDP. But we are also going to be buffeted by a slightly lower growth rate coming out of China. Chinese growth now down to 7.4% last year, projected in a sense to drop to under 7% in 2015. There is a sliding scale for China's GDP that will affect all those countries that are increasingly reliant upon that Chinese growth story for their future. Russia, too, we know, moving into negative growth territory, and Brazil, the great star of the last 10 years or so globally, moving perilously close to a recession over the course of the next year. So again, the BRICS countries of the world, the much vaunted BRICS countries, many of them, perhaps with the exception of India, that looks a lot better, but many of them not the flavor of the month quite as they were, and we are part of that slightly negative sentiment to the BRICS element in developing markets. Of course, my friends, of course, it goes without saying that this issue is one of the key impediments to our growth into the future, and I'm not going to speak too much about this. I need to get off quickly just in case the lights go out in time. So, Minister Nene stands up in front of Parliament yesterday, gives the budget. I must say, he looked a lot better than when he was in 2008 and he slipped off that chair at the SABC studios into one of the more embarrassing moments when the chair collapsed in front of the television cameras. He looked a lot better, and I must say he learned to speak with an autocue machine, which I think most of our politicians need to do. The question is, and here's a key differential between him and, of course, Trevor Manuel. I like to look at senior members of public office, and I like to see whether they have gravitas. Do they have that sort of that intangible feeling that whatever they say really is going to happen or really has got meaning? Trevor Manuel had gravitas when he spoke. Pravin Gordhan had great gravitas when he spoke, in my humble opinion. And the strange thing was, both Gordhan and Manuel were pretty senior members of the ANC itself, on the National Executive Committee of the ANC. And Nhlanhla Nene is not quite in that same league. Perhaps not yet, because it was his first budget, but he doesn't carry with him, in a sense, the weight of the political party. When I listen to Manuel or I listen to Gordhan, I sort of felt as though they would have an influence in their political party. Not quite sure if it was the same gravitas that Nene had. And the more I listened to the speech and the more I read the speech late last night, I just felt that Nene was like a sweeper in soccer. Those of you that play soccer will know what I mean. The sweeper who is the last line of defense, in a sense, to try and protect the goal. And I just got that feeling from that budget yesterday. That's exactly what he was. Trying to defend what really are so many policy own goals in our South African context. There's Nene, I think, the last line of defense. So Nene has got to deal with all of these issues. Hands tied, constraints, political constraints. He pontificates, he speaks in a climate in which there's good and bad in South Africa. We know what we're good at. This is a comparative chart of how competitive we are globally. The World Economic Forum do this very, very useful survey every 18 months or so, and we are very competitive. In fact, we're global leaders when it comes to the regulation of our securities exchange, when it comes to the soundness of our banks, the strength of investor protection in South Africa. We're in the top 10, in the top 3 for that matter. We do pretty well. But just to spoil your morning, Minister Nene has to speak and has to talk about large budgetary allocations to areas that we do not perform well in. Look at the survey. The survey shows that In the case of 148 countries surveyed in the world, 148 countries, we are 148th out of 148 when it comes to the quality of maths and science in our schools. 148 out of 148, almost full marks for being bottom of the pile. We are 148 out of 148 when it comes to our labor relations regime in South Africa. Clearly, education and labor remain at the heart of many of our problems, and we can throw money at it, which we do. There's no shortage of money or budgetary allocations for education, for health, but do we get value for our money? And that question remains after the budget. What does the budget do in terms of the perilous state of youth unemployment in South Africa? Now put it anywhere between 48 and about 60%. 30 to 40% of all South Africans are now out of work. Does the budget incentivize job creation? Yes, there were incentives for the small business sector, which I think are very positive, but I'm not convinced it goes nearly anywhere to really redressing this in a long-term solution. Our mining contribution to GDP has been in decline over the course of the last number of years due to a variety of global reasons, technical reasons, and political reasons within South Africa. Does the budget really address this? Perhaps it doesn't, and we need more broader policy initiatives to get this all right. We have an opportunity now in South Africa. Our rand is relatively low. Commodities are going to take a back seat for the moment. We should be addressing issues of our manufacturing sector, where manufacturing production has been in decline for the course of the last number of years. We should be incentivizing manufacturers in South Africa. Was there enough of that in the budget? I couldn't see that much. Our labor costs have been increasing in South Africa quite considerably. There are many other countries that are much more expensive than us, I must tell you. But if you look here, you'll see South Africa is now very similar to Korea. Look at that. The Netherlands there, Korea, South Africa, and the US. We're almost as expensive as a worker in the United States. That's an issue in terms of getting our growth. Whatever the figures are, whatever the allocations are, these are issues that we should be looking at. There, of course, South Africa. And I think importantly, and the Minister alluded to this, wage settlements in South Africa have been pretty positive for workers. Workers have got wage settlements well above the current rate of inflation. Somehow sort of redressing that, trying to get those wage settlements to be more in line with inflation is going to be the Minister's big task. And we all know unions are going to be chomping at the bit now again for fresh wage negotiations come the middle of the year. Can we now restore a semblance of reality to wage negotiations in a politically charged environment? That's going to be the core issue. There's a political issue here. It's not so much from the economic side. So, we saw in the budget, high levels of government spend. And these are taken from the Budget Review Book, which I urge you all to have a look at, because to me the Budget Review Book is a lot more interesting than the budget itself. There's so much hidden in that budget review, and there's so many interesting facets and aspects to analyze. Government spending, you can see the black line indicates social grants, and you can just see government spending on social grants, and you can just see the red line, interest on debt. Look at how interest on debt has risen substantially, and of course social grants. More government spending. We've seen government spending on education. Look at that spend. We've got the cash and we're spending. But there should not be any room for us being 148th in the world out of 148 on maths and science. We're not getting value for our buck. You can see the amount of money spent on social protection, of course on income grants as well. You can just see also, by the way, in that particular chart, that there's a lot more we need to do on housing and community amenities. Look how we haven't spent sufficiently on that, and hopefully part of the big rollout, and we saw in Gauteng, in their State of the Nation, State of the Province address, how the Gauteng Premier announced substantial infrastructure upliftments, particularly for township areas, that I absolutely applaud. All of that spending, of course, equals debt. And I suppose here's the rub for me looking beyond this budget. And Minister Nene quite rightly warned South Africans yesterday. You can't go on incurring this debt with these low levels of GDP growth, and I might add, and I'll add on, with an insufficient number of middle-class taxpayers to equally carry the burden. You've got to up those middle-class taxpayer numbers if those debt projections, that this comes from the budget review, it's from Treasury's own projections, continue to rise and rise quite dramatically. Our debt to GDP ratio in South Africa, well, it's now at about 45, 46% or so. Most economists would argue that we should not have that debt to GDP anywhere above 50% for a developing country country like ours. We've been creeping up to increased government debts over the course of the last year. Minister Nene said yesterday our debt to GDP will stabilize at 44, 45%. I'm going to watch that extensively over the course of the next few years. What then was this budget memorable for? It wasn't memorable for growth. It was memorable for taxes in ways to alleviate debt and alleviate those policy constraints and inefficiencies that we've lived with, and Di will talk about that. So, we left in a political malaise, I suppose. We heard good words from the minister yesterday. I liked so many aspects of the speech. Will he deliver, and will his government deliver? Does he have the credibility? Does government have the credibility to deliver? Does government have the credibility to cut back on unnecessary and wasteful expenditure when this kind of survey shows how much money we actually lose in South Africa to corruption? Does government have the credibility? I mean, two gentlemen I think who are extremely capable, and I'm happy that the economy and local government in particular is in Pravin Gordhan's hands. But credibility, of course, credibility, leadership, critical in South Africa going forward. And I'd like to believe everything, but time will tell, because these issues of credibility and leadership play on our ability to really take government seriously. So finally, I might have been a little critical, but ultimately I happen to love this country, and I strongly would urge you to keep calm and carry on. There's some very good reasons to continue to operate, invest, and work in South Africa. You know, we issued $1.7 billion of treasury bonds in July of last year. They were oversubscribed 3 times. Investors still wanted to buy our bonds. Our private sector, outstanding. They look as though they're going to turn around retail in the Southern Hemisphere, if Woolworths is to be believed. We still attract the lion's share of foreign direct investment in Africa compared to any other African country, notwithstanding the excellent African growth that Hilton mentioned to you. We're still an attractive destination. And for our business here in South Africa, population growth across the African continent is going to be the biggest driver for our business going forward, even in a stagnant South African market. What opportunity, in fact, there is. Just to make you feel good, there might be fighting and fisticuffs in our parliament, but it occurs elsewhere in the world as well. That's the parliament in Ankara in Turkey, where they go for each other, let me tell you. We are not alone. There they are in Kiev, my friends, in Kiev in the Ukraine granted a country under stress, but look at those politicians there in Kiev. It's not all bad here in this country. But finally, in my last little quote and slide, nugget of wisdom, which doesn't come from me, it's a very good little quote. It comes from a young Ghanaian entrepreneur by the name of Israel Moore Ayivo. And he said this last year. He's a young, hotshot Ghanaian. If you don't have any good idea, you are likely to waste money if it's given to you. If you don't have an idea, you can't even know how much money you need. This is because it's your ideas that give you the cost to pay. There's a young entrepreneur from Ghana. Wise words, I think. We need a lot better ideas in South Africa if we are going to make this budget really work. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Daniel. I think that was a very interesting overview of what we heard yesterday. And I think that as we look into the future, although there's lots of uncertainty as to where we're going to go, there are a lot of positive things to be considered. So just because we are accountants and auditors, we do need to now look at the numbers. So I'm going to hand over to Di Sacombe, who I don't think needs much introduction from a Mazars perspective. But Di is an admitted attorney with a master's degree in taxation and has been involved in tax for over 10 years. Di is currently the National Head of Tax Training at Mazars, and in this capacity provides training to Mazars partners, staff, and our clients. Di also consults on income tax matters, including corporate, individual, international tax, as well as VAT. Di, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. Right, good morning everybody. Now, after all the nice entertainment from Daniel, we have to get down to nitty-gritty. And as Michelle said, we do have to deal with some numbers. I did hope you heard that part in the intro about an attorney on the stage now. So when attorneys start with numbers, you know anything can happen. But what we need to do is look at the budget speech from a tax perspective. And I must admit, I think like most of you, I got so tired of every man and his dog giving their speculation about what was going to be increased for tax. And then hilariously, no man or his dog was actually anywhere near Minister Nene, it seems, in any walking in the parks, etc. Because the tax changes we had were quite unexpected, and actually, against all odds, we ended up with a bit of good news. So let's have a look at some of those. Now, every time we get a start to the budget speech, we get a list of general ideas about what we're looking at. Now, some of them are actually implemented in the proposed changes that he mentions in the speech, and like Daniel said, very importantly, the supporting documentation, and some of them really aren't. So let's look at the big guys for us. Well, of course we know that we have to increase tax revenues. Now, in all the changes that we're going to discuss today, people are estimating that we're probably going to bring in another round about 8.3 billion rand due to the tax changes that have been made. Now, I'm sure you've seen the figures bandied about in the press of 12 and 15 billion. So the 8.3 is looking a little bit shaky, and we have to kind of wonder where Minister Nene does think the other money's coming from. So yes, we've had some tax increases. I'm going to discuss those with you to actually give you an indication of what the extent of those are. But, as I say, bringing in 8.3 billion, we're going to have to see whether we hit the targets or not. The big issue is elimination of erosion of our corporate tax base. I want to discuss that to a degree. And then, of course, incentives for small business. Now, here I want to sound our first warning. We've had much discussion between seminars I've given you and the budget speech last year about the Dennis Davis Tax Committee. Now, as we all know, he's got his team and they're there to review our tax laws to see what's working and what isn't. Now, one of the first areas that the minister gave an instruction for the Dennis Davis Tax Review Committee to look at was small business. So there they produced this huge report saying what changes need to be made, how do we help fund small business, what tax incentives do they need. Now, ladies and gents, what was taken out of that by Treasury and what's been implemented is completely and utterly weak and ineffective. So here's my warning shot. It seems that when we get information out of any of the reviews that the Davis Commission's doing, if too much is put towards tax incentives, tax breaks, it seems that Treasury treads lightly. They are so over-focused on any potential abuse of incentives we're going to be given that the incentives, as I've just said, are weak and flaky at best. However, it does seem that the moment the Dennis Davis Committee actually raises some warning, that Treasury steps in immediately and starts talking about anti-avoidance and punitive legislation. Now, the one area that the Dennis Davis Committee still got to review, of course, is wealth taxes. Trusts and capital gains tax. We've had a warning shot for trusts in this budget speech, but it's nowhere near what's to come. Now, if the substantial area of tax increases in our years going forward is going to come from wealth taxes, we're going to have to keep a very strict eye on what the Dennis Davis Committee does recommend in respect of increasing our taxes on wealth taxes. Capital gains tax, estate duty, it's not going away. Even in this budget speech, we were told estate duty is not going away. They want to put more stuff into your estate, to put your estate duty on, levy your estate duty on. So again, what we're seeing, warnings coming out of the Davis Commission. Here's tax leakage. Be careful, Treasury. Treasury steps in. This is what we're going to do. This is anti-avoidance. And I'm going to give you one example. But, says the Dennis Davis Committee, we need some incentives. We need boosting. We need tax breaks. Oh, says Treasury. And they come out with what is an absolutely wishy-washy nonsense incentive for a micro-business regime that already has proven not to work. So let's go tinker with that some more. So, ladies and gents, we must be careful of this. And I think even more than our budget speeches each year, we've got to watch these reports coming out of the Dennis Davis Committee. And as I say, I'll address that. Now, what was interesting in this year's budget speech was in the documentation that comes with the budget speech is to actually look at who is putting money into the tax pot. Now, a lot of people this budget speech are speaking about, the old Minister Manuel's system of taxation, where Manuel believed that we were going to tax companies and that's where our revenue was going to come from. Now, of course, as company after tax, company profits are decreasing, the tax we can collect on companies is decreasing, and they are very clearly not the big payers into the tax pool anymore. So you'll see even in collections up to the end of March last year, individuals and trusts were contributing more than companies into our general tax pot that the fiscus is going to then utilize. But if we look at anticipated collections up to the end of March this year, we see that even more is being contributed by individuals and trusts than companies again. So ladies and gents, this trend is not going to change. And I love every time we get new words for bad things. So the new word for bad things is you'll see everywhere. South Africa's tax system has to be progressive and fair. Ignore fair, just worry about progressive. Because progressive means the more you have, the more we are going to bleed you for every single cent of tax that we can. That's what progressive means, and that's what's coming. Now, the big news, of course, was that all our income tax brackets were adjusted. Okay, fair enough. They were widened. But, of course, everybody except the lowest tax bracket, your tax rate went up by 1%. Now, I want to discuss this a little bit. So we've got, at the moment, our highest marginal tax rate of 41% and our lowest tax rate of 18%. Now, as I've said to you, the brackets were widened and we had this marginal rate increase. Now, I need to discuss a little bit about what this means. So if we look at our individuals and we look at our tax tables, we know that in respect of our individuals, we tax you on your taxable income. Now remember, taxable income will include any taxable capital gains you've made that year from disposing of any capital assets, shares, property, that kind of thing. So that's already in there. Now I need you to be careful, because when we look at this tax table, when we speak about the brackets, we know that in respect of our brackets, we've got a starting point to the bracket, in this case, and where my light is indicating 181,901, and a bracket ends at 284,100. So that's a bracket. Now, ladies and gents, this is the important part, and I'm going to use the top tax bracket to illustrate my point. So what I want you to understand is the top tax bracket now starts at 701,301. Now it's important to know that up to your taxable income of 701,301, you are going to pay tax of 208,587. Now what does that mean? It means that up to your 701,000 taxable income, you are going to pay what we call an average rate of tax. So I take your 208,000 and I divide it by 701,000 and I get approximately a 29.7% tax. That's your average tax. Now, for every 1 rand of taxable income that you go over 701,000, you will now pay 41% tax. That's your marginal rate. So ladies and gents, you've got to understand this mix between average rates up to where your bracket starts and then marginal rates afterwards. Also, what we've seen every year is this bracket space between where your bracket starts and ends has been made a lot wider each year, but not by so much this year. Now, what I want to indicate to you is what this actually means. And the very clever people in my office who can do numbers, thank goodness there's some of us, actually put this little table together for me to indicate this to us. So I want you to understand exactly what the less widening, if you like, of our brackets and the 1% increase in the marginal rates of tax did. If we take on the left-hand side of this screen, we've got your taxable income. Now, we've been lazy and we've just assumed the taxable income stays constant. So we've got a taxpayer all the way from relatively low in our tax brackets, 143,500, all the way up to just over 1.2 million. That's your taxable income. Now, if we look at the tax you would have paid on that, and I'm assuming a taxpayer under 65, and I've taken their rebates into account. If I look at the tax you would have paid on that in 2014, you will see those numbers on the second column from the left-hand side. Now what happens is between 2014 and 15, we had a budget speech and the brackets were widened. No increase in the marginal rate. Now the effect of that was, when we look at the tax that gave rise to in 2015, everybody paid less tax. So ladies and gents, the mere widening of a bracket caused everybody in those stratospheres of taxable income to pay less tax. Now what happens is we have the change from 2015 to 2016. Now ladies and gents, the interesting thing here is that every single tax bracket taxpayer is actually affected. And the best way for me to illustrate that is to draw your attention to the very far right-hand side of the page now. Because what happens now is we get every single taxpayer, even if they are still saving on tax in this lowest tax bracket, they are saving less. So their tax savings are not what they would have been, even in the 18% bracket, had the bracket been widened as much as it has been in the past. Our taxpayers above that, you will see, they actually end up in a situation where they are now paying more tax than they did before. So what we see here is, for the first time, taxpayers not only losing their tax savings, but actually now paying in more tax. So ladies and gents, the effect of the tax tables was twofold. Number one, everybody lost out. Even if you were paying less tax, it's not as less a tax as it could have been had the brackets been widened as before. And secondly, those who now have to pay in, there's not a tax saving, you're actually going to pay more tax. You've lost twice. Because number one, you've actually lost the tax saving that you had, and you're now paying in extra tax. So the effect of that tax table, ladies and gents, is a very, very clever effect. It looks like not much of an increase to increase your marginal rate by 1%, but the effect of the very narrow, if you like, widening of those tax tables will genuinely look at affecting all taxpayers and the taxes collected. Now, ladies and gents, always, I just wonder how much abuse our senior citizens can take. Because every year we get the rebates. And every year I have a look to see what's happening in respect of our tertiary rebate. Now, ladies and gents, the tertiary rebate is available to taxpayers 75 and over. And I must say, you just are not rewarded for living in these hard times to a ripe old age, even though I believe too many of us are now living too long. So what we see now is if you have made it to the ripe age of 75, you will be awarded for the 2016 year by your tertiary rebate increasing by a bold 99 Rand. It's our worst ever. So ladies and gents, there are going to be our rebates for the 2016 year of assessment, and as always, we get our tax thresholds. Now, I need to just raise a point here. Please remember your tax thresholds are taxable income you can earn and not pay any tax. But what we must look at as well as these thresholds are two things. Number one, you are still entitled to earn your local tax-free interest. 23,800 if you're under 65, 34,500 if you're 65 5 and over. So you're on top of this threshold of free taxable income. You on top of that can get your local interest exemption. And then of course we've got starting right now on the 1st of March our tax-free savings schemes. And that's also going to allow taxpayers to invest up to 30,000 each year, 500,000 over a lifetime, into these tax-free investments, and all your returns from those investments will also be tax-free. So please just be careful when we look at these tax thresholds, what they actually mean alongside our other tax-free investment opportunities. Now, what we do want to speak about is, I need you guys to be careful. We are looking at some changes coming to our retirement funds. Those changes were supposed to happen now on the 1st of March 2015. The changes to retirement funds are not going to happen on the 1st of March 2015. If we can get everyone to agree, they'll happen on the 1st of March 2016, next year, but if not, only 1 March 2017. Now, ladies and gents, I've just put these 2 slides in to indicate to you that Treasury has gone as far as it's going to go with any tax benefits when we get payouts from our funds. So these 2 tables, the one before and the one we're looking at the moment, deal with us getting lump sums from funds. You are going to be very heavily taxed if you pull out of a fund before your retirement date, but if you stay in there until death and retirement, then this is the table you're going to be looking at. We've seen absolutely no change in the budget speech in respect of these tables. Treasury is not even thinking about changing the tables. But one thing that they did give as a little throwaway issue in the documentation to the budget speech was in respect of the use that is currently being made of retirement annuity funds. So not just retirement funds, specifically retirement annuity funds. And Treasury raised concern. They did it so loosely that it's difficult to know what their intention is, but Treasury raised concern saying, we know that you are putting money into retirement funds so that that money is not going to be subject to estate duty when you die. Treasury wants to take steps against that to stop taxpayers using retirement annuity funds, RAs, to avoid estate duty. So what's our warning there? If they are already looking to put more assets, more value into your estate, including some of your lump sum payout from a fund on death, if they're looking to put that into your estate for estate duty purposes, estate duty is not going away. And in fact, in a talk we attended with Dennis Davis last year, Judge Dennis Davis, he actually made that clear to us. They want to tax wealth taxes more. Now, ladies and gents, every single year we see an increase in our medical rebates. As all of you know by now, there's no more deduction of medical expenses. We only get the rebates. 6A is a rebate available to everybody who belongs to a medical aid. So we've just seen those monthly cap amounts increasing. 257 for the member and first beneficiary has gone up to 270, and 172 for each additional member has gone up to 181. Now, to be honest, that's going to be an increase we see every year. What was interesting in the budget speech, though, was in respect of the 6B rebate. Now, this is going to be predominantly relevant to our taxpayers who are over 65, because what's going to happen is, if they are contributing to a medical aid, and in terms of our 6B provisions, they are making excessive contributions. So we are given certain parameters. We've got our taxpayers over 65 contributing to a medical aid. Now, if it's found that those contributions are excessive in terms of the 6B parameters, they do get an additional rebate in respect of 6B. Now, ladies and gents, please, I'm not talking about your qualifying medical expenses like doctor's bills and filling scripts at the pharmacy and that kind of thing. No. I'm talking about your fund, medical aid fund contributions. So what they're going to permit for the first time is, for a taxpayer over 65, they are going to be able to utilize the 6B rebate as well as the 6A rebate to actually reduce PAYE if you still, unfortunately, are over 65 and still employed and having to work for a living. But at the very least, the 6B rebate will be used to reduce provisional tax. So that's going to be a change we're looking forward to, and it's something that was raised with Treasury. Now, out the blue, this pops out, transfer duty. Now, to be quite frank, ladies and gents, this is sneaky, and this is what we can get from that word progressive. Because what they've done is they've absolutely amended transfer duty completely unexpectedly. And apparently our housing market is slowly recovering for residential properties, and they want to adjust our transfer duty rates from the 1st of March 2015. Now basically what they're going to do is they're going to say, okay, any property you purchase up to 750,000 will now not attract transfer duty. But unfortunately, at the top end of the housing market, round about 2.3 million, transfer duty is going to be higher than it has ever been for the past 4 to 5 years. So if we just have a look at that, you will see what they're proposing. They want you not to, as a purchaser, pay any transfer duty on the value up to 750,000. A very welcome increase in the next bracket, that between 750,000 and 1.25 million, we're at around about 3% transfer duty. Then again, they take us up a bracket saying, okay, between 1.25 and 1.75, we now 6%, also welcome. But unfortunately, now it gets expensive. 1.7 to 2.25, there are 8% kicks in. And ladies and gents, this is the meanie here. If you're purchasing property over 2.25 million, now you're at an 11% transfer duty. And ladies and gents, I'm sorry, but 2.25 million is just not the amount of money it used to be in the past. That is not an extensive price for a residential property, even if you manage to stay out of Century City or the City Bowl. Okay, so ladies and gents, please watch this transfer duty. Again, very welcome to the middle income earners, but looking for the purchasers of these higher end properties. Now, what we can say is we got our first warning shot for trusts. So not only did they put up the marginal rate for individuals by 1%, excluding the lowest tax bracket, but they also put up the rate of tax for trusts. So this was a little sneaky, that just a little one-liner in the budget speech saying the trust tax rate is going up from 40 to 41%. Now, ladies and gents, there's a reason trusts have been left alone. And the reason is this very, very nasty tax return for trusts that was implemented on the 6th of October last year. Now, what they did was, when this brand new trust return came out last year, everybody got such a fright at the immense disclosure required to complete this return. It's full of tax terminology. The detail required is unbelievable. The breaking down of expenses, some which will now be disallowed, it's immense. Everyone got such a fright that SARS said to us, okay, settle down. If you're still filling in these returns now, as you must, for the 2014 year of assessment, man, half the fields you don't have to fill in. Don't panic. Well, ladies and gents, that changes for any submissions for the 2015 year of assessment. So when you're submitting this new return for 2015, every single field is now compulsory. I can tell you the disclosure that this is going to give SARS in respect of trusts is absolutely unprecedented. So what we're going to see is SARS is going to be able to truly and accurately calculate the tax planning we are doing with trusts in respect of our current legislation. We are going to get an accurate indication of what it actually costs the fiscus with the current tax legislation. Now let's think about it. I put up the taxable income rate, tax rate of trusts to 41%. All our legislation at the moment, what does it do? It pulls income out of trusts for tax. Now, ladies and gents, they're not putting up that rate for their health. What they are going to look at, I think, when this new return comes in, they're going to assess the cost to the fiscus of the tax planning we do with trusts, having so many gains in income not taxed in trusts, but rather more efficient beneficiaries to the trust. And we've got the Dennis Davis Committee now stepping finally on to have a look at trusts and wealth taxes and CGT. So watch this space. But like I say, already we've had that increase. Now, you see, ladies and gents, this is something that makes me nervous. Firstly, It's nerve-wracking to me, and I want to indicate it to you and follow on actually from something Daniel said about the fuel levies. But what I want to do is focus on the second bullet point on this slide. Now, ladies and gents, VAT. Yes, it's a nuisance, and yes, it didn't go up and blah, blah, blah. But here's my issue. Most VAT vendors, SABC included, that are registered on what we call the invoice basis for VAT, have very, very difficult cash flow difficulties. Ladies and gents, not only the SABC. So what happens with the invoice basis? Well, the invoice basis actually causes a cash flow crunch because it is either the earlier of the vendor issuing the invoice or receiving payment that triggers when the VAT that they've levied on that consideration must be paid over to SARS. So what's the net effect? The net effect is that I as a vendor can issue an invoice, not receive any payment, not actually collect the output VAT, but still be liable to SARS for that VAT. Now, ladies and gents, that's no different from any poor vendor dealing with the municipality because they were once excited they won a tender, but have submitted their invoice to the municipality, not been paid for 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, but SARS doesn't care. SARS is like, yeah, you issued the invoice, can I have my output VAT? Oh, but not SABC. No, not them. Because you see, it's troublesome at the SABC. You guys just won't physically pay your licenses. So what do? They issue you the equivalent of a VAT invoice when they charge you for your annual license each year. The SABC is like everybody else now liable to SARS for that output VAT. Does that make sense? But they haven't been paid because even though it's the right thing to do, you haven't done it. Okay? So at the end of the day, now the SABC's got problems. Like every other vendor in the country, but hey, it's the SABC. So what do we start seeing now? Ladies and gents, this is serious. We are actually seeing tax laws being changed to benefit a particular effectively state-owned institution. So only SABC now will be allowed in respect of its license fees to go onto the payments basis. So what does that mean? SABC now only has to pay the VAT over to SARS when you do the right thing and pay your TV licenses. The fact that it issued the invoice months ago is not relevant anymore. Now, ladies and gents, this speaks of something that is starting to become a bit shaky. And I want to raise it again when we see a little bit later in respect of those levies. Now remember the huge incentives we were going to have for small business. Like Daniel raised for us, we've got this rampant unemployment. Small business is supposed to solve the problem. All they did was tinker with this turnover tax. This regime has never been worked, this micro business tax. It only deals with business that makes less than $1 million a year. And ladies and gents, only effectively retail and manufacturing. Services aren't really favored by this regime. So what do? They play with these brackets. Thanks, we've got new brackets to look at. Ladies and gents, this is one of the issues that I need you guys to be careful about. This apparently is the root of all evil, and it's the famous BEPS. And this is called base erosion profit shifting. Now, the only thing I want you to come out of this with is the following. Number one, if you as a resident of South Africa, whether you're a company, a trust, or an individual, if you are dealing with a non-resident who is a connected person to you, family member, if they are a beneficiary of a trust, 20% shareholding, I need you to be careful. The major focus is going to come on whether you are dealing with that person at arm's length. Are you charging market-related prices? Are you earning from them proper market-related income? Now, you see, this is this big issue raised by the Davis Tax Committee. They say to South Africa, oh, you are losing thousands. Everybody's pulling money out of South Africa with excess expenditure, pulling it offshore. South Africa's losing. Oh my goodness me. Do we see action like you've never seen it before? SARS has listed this as audit issue number 1. Tax returns are going to place greatest focus on disclosure. They want to know where these international transactions are. And that's why I say to you, if there's negativity subjectivity, risk, leakage coming out from the Davis Commission, this is the type of reaction we see. Please do not think this whole issue of transfer pricing, as it's also called, is an issue only for companies. It's going to be a big disclosure in the new trust returns as well. Now, ladies and gents, the famous fuel taxes. Now, this I need us to be careful of because, like Daniel rightly said, he said that if we look at these levies, and we can actually break down that 80 cents increase into two parts. Number one is a general fuel levy. That's now gone up by 30.5 cents a litre. Last year, it only went up 12 cents a litre, by the way. Now it's gone up 30.5 cents a litre. Now, what does this do? Well, of course, this is going to build our infrastructure, and this is so we don't have to pay so much for e-tolls if Helen ever lets them into the province. This is the story. Now, where does that big 80 cents come from? Not actually the fuel levy. It comes from the 50 cents a litre increase for the road accident fund. Ladies and gents, we're not collecting on these fuel levies to build infrastructure. We've got a 50 cents increase, only 8 cents last year, to bail out a road accident fund which is mismanaged and broke. That's what that increase is. Are you spying a trend here? So, ladies and gents, this is where we come back to saying, yes, this is going to be an extremely punitive measure, like Daniel said. The oil price goes up, and then we've got that on top of this levy. But again, what is the levy predominantly being raised for? Not the infrastructure build we need for transport, but as I said, to bail out the RAF. Now, you see, if we look at those increases, I've put a table there for you just to indicate that they've gone up drastically from the increases in 2015 to now what we've got for 2016. But you see, what they will do though is assist you that if you're paying all those levies in respect of diesel and you are actually in the areas of mining, agriculture, forestry and fishery, they're going to try and give you some of that levy back. Especially as I've said, on diesel, they're going to give you a diesel refund. Now, ladies and gents, we've got to watch this. At the moment, if you're claiming diesel refunds, you are being extremely heavily audited by SARS. Now they're saying to us they want to delink these diesel refunds, take them completely out of exposure and the disclosure in the VAT return, and actually rather have a separate system on its own. We don't know if it's going to help or hinder at this stage, but at the end of the day, that's where we are. Another thing that makes me nervous, suddenly we see electricity taxes going up by 2 cents per kilowatt. Now again, ladies and gents, what are these extra electricity taxes going to be used for? The momentum, the feeling in the budget speech was we're going to use these extra electricity taxes collected to help fund other energy saving incentives and initiatives, solar, etc. Ladies and gents, if this extra tax collected is used for an Eskom bailout, we're going to see strike 3 in this trend where we're almost using a tax collection system to stopgap inefficiencies in various state-owned enterprises. So we're going to have to listen in good faith. One of the interesting things, especially for some people in our audience, we've been waiting to see our REITs, our new real estate investment trusts. Ladies and gents, this is the regime for listed property unit trusts and property loan stock companies. So our property unit trusts and property loan stock companies, if you went and listed on the JSE, we could put you in the new REIT regime. Well, what's quite exciting is they want to extend that to unlisted property owning companies and set up a very similar regulatory framework. So for those of you in that who've been wondering, that's exciting. Now you see, as a lawyer, I battle to make sense of this. I hear about how we've got more people more people getting grants than we've got people employed, etc. But now I hear that our UIF has an accumulated a surplus of 90 billion. So who's paying these unemployed people, I wonder? Because it doesn't seem the UIF is. So what they've done, quite rightly and quite frankly, is they've said, yeah, okay, we've collected a bit much. We're 90 billion in surplus. We're going to work out more ways to give it away, so don't worry, we'll sort that out. But quite nice, ladies and gents, for the next year, we're actually all going to be given a big fat UIF break. make. So what's going to happen essentially is you've got contributions that both an employer and employee used to make that could be made to a maximum of 148 Rand a month will be reduced to 10 Rand a month. So your UIF contributions are going to be reduced from this 140 maximum to 10 Rand per month. Only for a year because they say we've got enough from you. Ladies and gents, always the excise duties, but please, even though the lights go off, I don't want engagements and I don't want babies because it's too expensive, okay? Because as you see, sparkling wine is our worst hit, 48 cents a bottle, and cigars are not far behind. So just behave when the lights are off and do your bit, okay? Lastly, ladies and gents, please, if you've had enough, you're feeling like some people you want to go, well, they're giving you more money to go with, okay? Now, this surprised me because this was a big deal and it was hidden away in the supporting documentation to the budget speech. This wasn't mentioned in the main speech, and I don't know why. Ladies and gents, we've seen a fundamental change in our exchange controls. Number one, your annual capital allowance, the amount you can take out each calendar year, has gone up, and this is from the 1st of April this year. It's gone up from 4 million to 10 million. You must be over 18. You must have the 10 million and a tax clearance, okay? Just, details. But what is nice is that discretionary allowance of 1 million. Now, ladies and gents, you have to be over 18 and have the 1 million. We've done that. But you do not need a tax clearance to take the discretionary 1 million out each year. And what they've done is they've taken away all the subcategories of what you could do with your 1 million you took out. Before you had to buy gifts for people, travel, maintain people, all sorts of jazz. That's all gone now. I do laugh at South Africa though. In the actual the reading around the budget speech, they use the word and they say to us, please take your 1 million out, use it for anything, but it must be a legal purpose. So, as long as we all straight, we all know. So, ladies and gents, what this means is with the tax clearance, you can now take from April this year up to 10 million a calendar year. With no tax clearance, you can take out 1 million, so that would actually give you 11 million to take out a year. Very, very strange to see, but it is a step towards the relaxing of the exchange controls. So, ladies and gents, a bit of a mixed bag for tax. Like I said, keep your eye on any reports from the Dennis Davis Commission and where that's going to lead us. Before I finish this morning, firstly, just to say thank you for joining us again, but I've got a very, very blurry-eyed tax team because we were all sitting till 1, 2, 3 this morning getting your budget booklets and your pocket guides ready for you. So please, please, as you leave the venue, don't forget to pick up a pack. It's got all the budget speech information in, all the rates, everything is there. And again, thank you very, very much for joining us this morning.